Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome everybody again to another episode of our show. Today bringing you another really awesome guest involved in creating a better tomorrow. Today we have the honor of being joined on the show by Dr. Arti Garg. She is head of technology strategy and evaluation in the Office of the Chief Technology Officer and Senior Distinguished Technologist at Hewlett Packard Enterprise. Previous to this role, Dr. Garg served as Deputy Global Chief Technology Officer for Data and Artificial Intelligence and Lead Sustainability and Innovation Architect. She also served as Chief Strategist for the AI Strategy and Solutions Organization, overseeing Hewlett Packard Enterprise's advanced AI technology programs. And she also served as Emerging Market and Technology Director at Cray, which was acquired by Hewlett Packard Enterprises back in 2019. Over her career, Dr. Garg has held several data science leadership roles in the computing and industrial sectors, including roles at Datapipe, Energy, and GE. In the past, Dr. Garg has also worked in the United States government at the White House Budget Office, where she oversaw around $5 billion of R&D investments at the Department of Energy. She was also a legislative advisor in U.S. Congress as an American Physical Society-sponsored Science and Technology Congressional Fellow with the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And her science policy journey also includes working for University of California Office of the President. Dr. Garg holds a Ph.D. in physics from Harvard, as well as a master's in aeronautical and astronautical engineering from Stanford. And she did postdoc work at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, part of their Institute of Geophysics and Planetary Physics. And when she's not doing all that, she's also the founder and chair of a really interesting group called Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally, which is a national organization that's dedicated to increasing city, county, and state level engagement by professionals with backgrounds in STEM. A lot of really cool topics to get into today. We're honored to have with us Dr. Arti Garg. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show today.
Thank you for having me here, Ira.
It's wonderful having you. I'm really glad we got the opportunity to finally set this up. You've been extremely busy, but really glad you're here. Love to start off as we typically do by handing you the floor for a little bit. Was reading all about you before the show. Would love to hear sort of the story from the early days. I saw that you were sent off to space camp, I think, when you were something like 5 or 6 years old. You got into aerospace and aeronautics then, which take us back a little bit. And take us up to 2007, if you would, to your PhD, where you're really looking for, you study physics, but you're really a cosmologist by training. You're studying sort of the origins of the universe and dark matter. Take us to then too, because that was a really cool beginning to it all.
Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah, in some ways, I like to, maybe it's a little bit that I never grew up. A lot of kids say they want to be an astronaut when they're a little kid, but it took me a long time to decide to give up on that specific goal, but instead continue to sort of work in that space. So, I sometimes have joked that maybe my first love was outer space. As a young child, I I happened to have a fairly large window that I could see right outside from my bed at night. So I used to kind of watch the constellations as they changed over the course of the year, and used to just sometimes love staring out the window in the middle of the night. And at the same time, like maybe a lot of kids, got the idea that maybe one day I would like to be an astronaut myself. So So, part of that journey included going to space camp. I was actually lucky enough, this was a trip that my school organized. Not every kid went, but I was one of the kids that was able to go and experience some of the training exercises, or at least the way that they make them available to fourth graders. And so my interest in space didn't decline as I got older. It actually continued to grow. So when I started my undergraduate studies, it was only natural that I would study physics, because I started to get interested not just sort of in space and potentially traveling to space, but also kind of understanding how the universe evolved. I think, again, like lots of good astrophysicists, I read A Brief History of Time. I was in middle school or high school, and that got me very interested in some of the open questions around cosmology. So, I continued to pursue physics education and major in physics as an undergrad. I started to sort of explore some other interests at that time as well. So I maybe not commonly was also an English literature major with a specialization in Shakespeare and theater. And actually, one of the interesting things that my undergraduate English thesis advisor said was that, in some ways, studying literature, studying physics, they're really just two different ways of approaching approaching how we understand the world and the universe around us. One is very bottoms up, and with physics, it's very bottoms up, and one is somewhat top down. And for some reason, that really always resonated with me. And so as a result, it was actually a little bit of a question for a little while as to what I would do after I finished my undergraduate work, and whether I would continue in physics, or I seriously thought about potentially joining a Shakespeare company as well. And in the end, I quite ironically decided that I was a morning person. I was also a coxswain on the crew team as an undergrad, and decided I was a morning person, so I couldn't really live a life in the theater. And, of course, eventually I became a ground-based observational astronomer, which means I didn't sleep at all at night when I was at the telescope. So it's funny how things work out. But yeah, so I decided to pursue Ph.D. in physics, and but sort of in between, I realized, well, maybe before I became a ground-based astronomer, I thought maybe I'd be interested in space-based telescopes. And I felt that having a little bit of a background in aerospace engineering might be a good solid foundation for that as well. So I had the opportunity to spend a year getting a master's degree in aerospace engineering. So that's what I did, and then started my PhD in astrophysics. And that took me a couple different places. It took me to spend a lot of time down in Chile at the telescope. So even though I had to learn to stay up all night and sleep after the sun came up, the trade-off was I got to spend time in a really different part of the world and meeting really different people. So that was in and of itself a pretty great experience.
Absolutely. And there's a nice synopsis of Dr. Garg's work on the internet. I think when you moved on to Lawrence Livermore, and you sort of there's this astrophysics and the time domain report, which basically, after you're done studying, some of the basics of dark matter and the composition of our galaxy, you talk about next steps that we need to do more of study these transients and focus more on time domain astrophysics, and a lot of things just went over my head, but it looks like a really cool report. And then from there, you come down from the cosmos and you head off to Capitol Hill.
Yes.
And here, you joined the House Foreign Affairs subcommittee as a legislative assistant. And here, you're doing you're not doing cosmology at this point, but you're focusing on a wide range of topics, everything from foreign food assistance, labor rights. No, you're doing some stuff with aerospace export controls, bioterrorism, nuclear cooperation. Talk a little bit about this era, because it seems like now the themes of what you're focusing on drastically expand. You got a lot more responsibilities now to think about.
Yeah, and it's probably useful to sort of draw the thread back through the time I was also a graduate student. So I actually started my PhD on September 11th, 2001.
Mm.
And so that in many ways defined a lot of my experiences as a graduate student. Um, I should probably be embarrassed to say this, but when I was in high school and middle school, I used to be like, I don't care about current events. They're always changing. Like I want to study the cosmos. It takes longer to change, but that shifted quite a bit when after 2001, at least for me. And I got much more interested in how government decision making just affected people's lives. And so I actually was a policy fellow even during my graduate research days. I took a quarter off and I came to Washington as a policy fellow at the National Academies, which kind of opened my eyes to some of the things that some of the decisions that government makes that would be better if they were, potentially informed by at least the perspectives of scientists and engineers, or at least be more kind of holistically informed. And also doing so much of my graduate research in another country, I also just sort of saw the ways that even like, our foreign policy can affect the ability to sort of advance even what might seem like very basic and esoteric science, such as astrophysics. So that's kind of the backdrop to my interest in science and science policy. And even as a researcher at Lawrence Livermore Lab, I actually wore two hats. Continued to study astrophysics, and then I also worked on the some of the mission-oriented work around non-proliferation and as well at the National Lab. And so in some ways it became maybe the natural next step to spend more time in Washington. And for me, working in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, subcommittee on terrorism, nonproliferation, and trade, fit really well with my background, both interest in foreign affairs and diplomacy, as well as some of the sort of more national security lens that I started to think about as a postdoc. And yeah, but when you work on the Hill and you work in a committee, I came in thinking I'd mostly work on the sort of export controls and dual use technology area, but ended up spending the majority of my time around biosecurity. And partially that was because the sort of 9/11 grade report had come out, and the US received an F on our biosecurity response relative to some of the other changes that had been made since September 11th. And so that became a focus area for our subcommittee. And what's sort of interesting now that it's 2024 to think about is, as I learned more about biosecurity, remember my background is in physics and aerospace engineering, what people started to come to me and said, yes, bioterrorism is a concern, but what's a real big concern is like if a highly virulent disease starts to spread. And so I actually got very interested in pandemic response and also the sort of animal to human transition, which we now call like One Health. And so, many people don't know that Joe Biden actually had sponsored a couple of bills that passed the Senate in the sort of 2003-4 era, and I leveraged some of that legislation to draft my own bill while I was on the Hill. Unfortunately, things changed and it didn't move forward, but yeah, it's funny how things sort of evolve over time.
Yeah, it's interesting here bringing up One Health, because one of the things we have focused on in sort of the bio preparedness, biodefense space has been this bipartisan commission on biodefense, which is trying to put together large sums of money to increase the grade, let's just say, and so we are better prepared the next time when God forbid the next thing comes our way. But talking about big pools of money now for a minute, and we'll get to Hewlett Packard Enterprise shortly. But one other place I'd love to go is to your experiences at the White House Budget Office and some of your Department of Energy work, because don't know if you got a chance to see some of the episodes. We had Kathy Huff and Rita Barnwall on, sort of current and former assistant secretary for the Office of Nuclear Energy, and then we also profiled from your old shop Heather Whitley and Andrea Kreitzer from Lawrence Livermore and the inertial confinement fusion program. You have this $5 billion basket of investments where they're like, yeah, Arti, make sure these investments pay off. They're important for the
Yes.
future. I saw you on this interesting letter that was copied to President Obama's science advisor, talking about the responsibilities of the United States and the ITER tokamak reactor and all that. Talk about this time, because I think this is another important piece of your what created your full story here. So say a few words about this time, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. I think when I had, when I first came to Washington as a fellow, I had sort of heard about from my mentor for my fellowship about, the White House Office of Management and Budget, or, more people know it as the White House Budget Office, as this sort of like really interesting place to work that nobody really thinks about or talks about, because it's actually it's career civil service. It's not a political appointed office. So there are people there that span many, many administrations. When I joined, there were people there that had been there since the Carter administration, for example. And so in some ways, it's a very important sort of institutional memory of the White House, because it's apolitical in principle. Anyway, and so I joined as what was called a program examiner, and that meant I was on the budget side of the Office of Management and Budget, and I had the responsibility for putting together the president's budget request for Department of Energy's Office of Science and the Advanced Research Projects Agency Energy. So these are kind of more the basic and early stage applied research arms of the Department of Energy. And then you also have responsibility of sort of working with the policy councils to ensure that the budget, when it's executed, really does meet policy priorities. And also, one of the leaders in my organization used to say, we're the only people in the entire government whose primary job is to be advocates on behalf of the American taxpayer and ensure that tax dollars are being spent in a way that most benefits, American people. And so it's hard to explain what it's like to work at OMB in some ways, because it is such a unique organization. First of all, you have people, I guess I was in my early 30s, but you can have people even in their 20s with, walking around with responsibility for, billions of dollars of, and they're the primary liaison to the agency and that part of the agency that that executes around that piece of budget. And for me, the Department of Energy Office of Science is I don't know what fraction of it is physics research, but it's a very large fraction of it is physics research that cuts across a lot of different areas. So nuclear physics, high energy physics. There's a biological environmental sciences, but a lot of that is biophysics as well. There's also BER, and I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but and fusion science and high performance computing. So those are kind of major areas under the Office of Science's larger umbrella. And there are something like 10 national labs that are managed by the Office of Science. And then, as I said, in addition to that, I had the responsibility for, at that time, the relatively newly formed Advanced Research Projects Agency for the Department of Energy, ARPA-E. And so it's a really it's hard to explain, because I felt like it was important for me to really understand all of the research we were funding. Partially the time period that I was there, we were in the midst of a lot of pressure from the Hill to reduce spending. We actually had there was a deal that was made that cut funding substantially. We were working with, furloughs toward the end of the time that I spent at OMB. So we were furloughed one day every 2 weeks due to the caps and cuts in budget that that for the federal government. And so for me, the person who had 5 majors and, at one point joked that she would major in general science as opposed to just physics. It was actually kind of fun to learn about all of these different programs and all of the different underlying research areas that the Department of Energy funded. At the same time, it was a really difficult period because the Department of Energy tends to fund a lot of very large research facilities, some of which can have operating budgets into the hundreds of millions. And so then we had to do a lot of balancing between, do you keep these facilities funded? Do we keep the construction of ongoing facilities going? And then how do we actually fund the researchers who are doing that, some of whom are at universities, some of whom are at national labs. And so that's actually where the ITER project came in. It's the ITER, it's an international tokamak project. It's a consortium of many countries, and it was very far over budget and also over time. And so it was a difficult, kind of negotiation because it also involved our diplomatic relations with some other countries, France, India, Germany. So it was a kind of difficult it was a difficult challenge to navigate because some of that budget was then coming out from other areas of research that would allow us to use the facility and better understand the scientific output that came from it. So, it's one of the best things I ever did. There were a lot of areas that I worked in that might not be obvious from what my portfolio was, but worked on things like graduate education. There was a whole pillar of the graduate science education plan that the Obama administration put out, and that was actually due to some of the work that I did behind the scenes at OMB. I worked with a couple of colleagues on really improving access to Earth observation data, and it's kind of cool to see that still playing out and say how the Department of Commerce handles satellite data and weather data. And so, you can have a lot of impact doing something very, very small, working anywhere within the White House consortium. And so from that perspective, it's hard to describe, but a really unique experience. And I guess the one other thing I'll say, because eventually we should come to what I do nowadays. And one of the things that I did was, oversee the advanced computing research program. And part of that included signing off on the launch of the Exascale initiative, which was the initiative to fund the development of an exaflop computing system. And that very directly ties to where I eventually ended up at Cray Supercomputers.
Yeah, I was thinking about that because I remember coming across the Exascale project a little while ago when I was because I've been profiling a lot of the ARPA groups and sort of the ARPAization of these various organizations, which I think is fascinating because the fact that we're giving scientists the ability to work on the cutting edge and not always worry about whether there's a commercial product here and there. But no, that's a beautiful transition because I want to go into everything HPE now, and I guess admitting my ignorance here for a minute, but I'm in a house here. I got plenty of Hewlett Packard printers and personal computers, and I did not realize that in 2015, this tiny little unit of $30 billion in revenue now, Hewlett Packard Enterprises was spun off that does everything but personal computing and printing, so servers and storage, networking, and all sorts of consulting. Introduce us to the organization, if you would, a little bit for those that are unfamiliar with the Hewlett Packard Enterprise.
Yeah, well, actually, you did a great job. And so in some ways, it's all the stuff you don't see. And, as a consumer, you probably wouldn't interact with on a daily basis. So servers that are sitting in your data center that do everything from, host e-commerce and email systems to with the, especially now with the acquisition of Cray Supercomputers, run the largest and fastest supercomputers in the world. And so it's computing at a big scale, and in some ways also computing at a invisible scale. The other thing that we have as part of our portfolio of companies and capabilities is Aruba networking. So you will be surprised where if you look up and you might be in an office building, you'll see that the Wi-Fi router and access point has it says Aruba on it. So Aruba is also part of HPE's portfolio of products. And so I guess in that way, those are those are smaller and more visible than supercomputers, but at the same time, when everything's working well, and it usually is with Aruba, you don't pay that much attention to your Wi-Fi, hopefully, when you're at your office or even in the airport or something like that.
Sure, most definitely. Yeah, let's talk about several of the things that you're doing now, and I think I was thinking we maybe could split it up into sort of the artificial intelligence and data science, and then maybe segue back to the where you see the exascale computing and all that going. One of the interesting, because AI is just such a hot topic. I saw this article from a couple of years ago that you wrote called "Ready to Navigate the AI Accelerator Landscape." I spent a lot of time profiling companies doing AI magic and having their little algorithm, whatever the case may be. Talk a little bit about the world of AI accelerators and a little bit of this particular niche that you fit. Well, it's not a niche, really. It's a major piece of this puzzle. What is an AI accelerator, and a little bit of what's going on at HPE with regard to the development of these accelerators?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And maybe it's worth also first stepping back and kind of thinking broadly about artificial intelligence and data science, because AI accelerators tend to fit into what is maybe capturing everyone's attention right now, especially with the advent of generative AI and ChatGPT. But it's part of a bigger story. And the bigger story is this sort of explosion of data science, and then we started to use the word AI more than data science, and that maybe over the last 10 years those two words have sort of flip-flopped a little bit. In some ways this is nothing new. In other ways it's really a marriage of advanced computing allowing people to take very large data sets and start to derive insights from them, start to derive kind of better understanding of whatever it is that created the data set. And now with the advent of generative AI, start to do more than just sort of draw insights from the data or predictions on a new set of data, but really start to kind of produce what seems like new stuff, although interestingly enough, generative AI also works by just predicting what you think might come next. But so that's kind of the larger world of data science and AI. And something that happened in 2018, but really some of this started to happen before that, is that we went from maybe more statistics-based models that you would potentially do more like linear operations on or calculations on to neural networks and something called deep learning, which was multi-layered neural networks, and the use of matrix operations became much more common in data science and artificial intelligence. This was also easier than to process data from, say, images or things that weren't just lists of numbers. And you can represent lots of things in lists of numbers, but it became useful to kind of think about data in other less structured formats and being able to interact with it directly rather than trying to make it fit a kind of more fit and easier to work with in the easier to work with mathematical structure, let's put it that way. And so with that came an interest in first GPUs, or graphical processing units, became much more popular within the data science and AI community because they were kind of well suited to the types of models that were being developed, these deep learning models that lent themselves to the way that they they calculate, they run computations, but you also then started to see people would talk about, well, we're outrunning Moore's law. And that's because what was really happening in some ways is that, well, there's multiple ways to think about this, but the simplest way to think about this is that, the computational requirements of the models that were most popular were growing faster than Moore's law said sort of the transistor size would shrink. And so that the density of computing that you could get at the same cost would grow. And I bring this up because my husband works in semiconductor manufacturing, and he always says, no, I make sure we still follow Moore's law. And so, so I bring that up because of that. But so what started to happen is that the demands of AI, and then particularly with this invention of a mathematical operator called a transformer, which really led to the types of models that we're seeing in generative AI now, just exploded exponential growth. I mean, even on a log plot, you just see this line that looks like it's going straight up in terms of computational demands. And so we started to think differently about, well, what if instead of having sort of somewhat general purpose processors, we had AI specific processors that could accelerate the AI computations that you needed to do. So that's where the kind of notion of an AI accelerator came from. I think people call it an accelerated compute. It might be a misnomer. I don't know. We used to also refer to them as AI ASICs, so kind of AI specific or application specific ICs, and then we started using AI accelerators because they were, they worked for multiple models. I think that was the reason we decided that we should use that terminology instead. And so, at HPE, we build systems. And so we don't necessarily design our own processors. We work very closely with, all the vendors in the market to build systems that incorporate their processors. And so starting with Cray and then moving into my time at HPE, we undertook efforts to really understand, all of the vendors that were putting out technology in the accelerator space. And at one point, they were like, couldn't keep up with them. There was a new one every day. There was a lot of venture capital going into this area because the sense that general purpose processors couldn't necessarily keep up with the demands of AI models. And so, what started to happen is, enterprises or organizations that wanted to run AI were just hit with all of these processor vendors coming to them saying, hey, you're not going to be able to run AI at the scale or in the way you want to. And so you should buy our specialized engine. And what we decided to do instead was work with these vendors as, to kind of help our customers understand which of these vendors was good at what, which ones are kind of mature even from a business standpoint, because there's a lot of considerations there as well. If I invest in a processor, I want to make sure that, if something goes wrong, I have spare parts. I have kind of manufacturing capacity for next generation processors. And so that's really what we started to do. And we started to see some differences between processors that were more specialized for training AI models, versus processors that are more specialized for running AI models. And, some of that might have to do with how much data you want to flow past the processor. If you're training, you might be willing to just sort of wait till you've accumulated a lot of data and then, run your computations. Whereas if you're running inference, you may not want to wait for a lot of data. You might want answers very quickly. And so it's been a very interesting space because it's sort of ebbed and flowed. For a while, there was like 50, hundreds of vendors, and then they kind of, many of them started to consolidate, get acquired, or just sort of, cease to exist. And now I'm starting to see again more vendors, but probably a little bit more in the inference space, whereas previously they were in the training space. And, of course, you still have the sort of original GPU vendor, NVIDIA, continuing to innovate and evolve their own technology in this space. as well.
Sure. And when speaking about these different accelerator tools, I think this, and again, I come from the life sciences, so if I say something stupid here, just like, that's stupid. I'll explain it to you. The principle of heterogeneous computing, and you have HPE has a report on this heterogeneous computing point of view and call for action. And here, it seems like you're now, after all the work you've done in AI accelerators, looking at the development of these systems that have all sorts of different computational units, from CPUs to GPUs and all these other cool acronyms, which I don't know what they do, but they're all kind of cool sounding. Talk about heterogeneous computing, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think you actually did a pretty good job of explaining it, and which is that the sort of underlying theory here, and I sort of talked a little bit about training and inference, and then on top of that, and we're seeing this in some advanced applications like weather, say, where you might have some kind of more traditional high performance computing simulation workloads that are running alongside AI. You might be taking an AI model and saying, hey, it's very computationally expensive, or our physics isn't very good to run the simulation in this part of a large in-body simulation, but I can use AI to predict what it is, and that's good enough for what I'm trying to achieve. And so in order to sort of support the variety of workloads that scientists and even increasingly enterprises want to run, they may not need one type of computing. And so even though I'm kind of referring to GPUs as general purpose, they're still better suited to certain types of computations than others. And so what we were really starting to think about is, how do you enable in the same system with data that can, with storage and data management systems that can talk to any type of compute, build a system that provides performance, flexibility, scalability, for a lot of different applications, especially sort of this sort of most cutting edge computational intensive ones, that where people don't want to wait months. You can't wait months for a weather simulation. It's pretty useless at that point. And so really trying to understand what it would take to build truly heterogeneous systems, as opposed to systems that, maybe you've got a rack of GPUs sitting next to a rack of CPUs or something like that. And again, there's been a lot of evolution in this space over the last few years as well, seeing kind of integrated boards that have CPUs that can do more than just feed data to the GPUs. You can actually have, both a mixed type of computation. And so we are seeing a lot of innovation in the space right now, and I expect that to continue.
And one of those places for continued innovation is on the edge. And this we talked a little bit about this on previous shows. So from the data center to the cloud and now to the edge with all these fancy devices that we have. Could you say a few words of where edge AI is going and some of your visions for the potential of AI and all the things that we're connected to in our daily lives?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are a lot of different ways to think about what the potential for putting AI at the edge is. For me, one of the more interesting ones is just sort of accelerating decision making at the edge without having to send data back to the cloud or a data center somewhere, so that you can interpret it. And what that can enable, for me, the most interesting thing, because I'm an aerospace engineer. I like thinking about, things that move, is that, that can enable sort of more precise feedback control. And so the more powerful you can put AI computing at the, AI processing and computing at the edge, the more you can enable things like truly autonomous driving, for example, because you can actually process the data and make decisions on the data in as close to real time as possible. So, for me, that's one of the most interesting capabilities. There's other things that maybe are a little bit more you don't necessarily think about it, but a little bit more day to day, the more that I can push a certain amount of AI to the edge, the less I'm sort of dependent on having a good cell phone connection or having, losing touch with, for whatever reason, I don't know, there's a thunderstorm or there's, some kind of natural disaster with sort of my home base. And so even for other types of operations, I'm a very large, retail chain.
Mm-hmm.
And if I lose if all of my systems, my point of sale system, for example, requires me to talk to some centralized, provider, then I can't run my store. And let's say I'm a hardware store and there's a natural disaster or something like that. People want to go buy sandbags. It's actually a problem for people not to be able to go, make purchases. And so I think one of the things that I've always thought about is that when you lose connectivity to some kind of centralized,
Mm-hmm.
capability, it's often when you need it the most. It's often when you need whatever edge computing system you want, you have the most. And so I think I think that being able to push more capabilities out to the edge and allowing certain independent, decision making, independent operations at the edge, has a lot of benefits, many of which you don't think about till you sort of run through scenarios and, potentially run through sort of the worst case scenarios or the corner cases. And for me, having a background in aerospace engineering, this is very natural.
Right.
A project I worked on as an undergrad, it was literally all contingency planning. Is for the Gravity Probe B experiment, but it was like, what can break and how would we fix it? If we like imagining every scenario by which, in my case, heating and cooling systems could break on the satellite, and then how would you fix it remotely? Because or assuming a certain lag and sending, information back. And I guess for me also that makes sort of this edge computing operating independently a little more comfortable as well,
Mm-hmm.
because in space, the physics doesn't allow you to have real-time communication. And so you can't expect, to be able to talk to an edge asset, and that edge might be Mars. In real time. And so, and I think that's something that with the advent of edge computing and more powerful and energy efficient, I think that's really important, capabilities, you can, really start to realize like a lot more, capability in remote places or disconnected places or partially, kind of tenuously connected places.
And speaking, you just brought up energy efficiency, and I mentioned in your bio this this role you had in terms of lead sustainability architect, and I know HP's had this sort of project sustainability dashboard, and in terms of evaluating and how you evaluate these really power hungry applications. Could you say a few words about that responsibility that you
Yeah,
have?
no, and it was a really exciting kind of responsibility or project for me. Now Project Sustainability Dashboard has graduated. We've gone through, I think, our third release now, and it's the HPE Sustainability Insight Center. And really what the goal is to provide, end users with a unified view of the energy usage and carbon emissions associated with operating their IT assets. And I say operating because we've done some studies to show that the majority of carbon emissions associated with a server, for example, actually occur during the period that you're using it, the electricity that you, generate to power it in its use phase, as opposed to sort of what's embedded in it from its manufacturing or end of life processes. So we focus there first. And what we do is provide, we gather real-time power usage data, we gather information about where that asset is located, and then information about the carbon intensity of the grid where that asset is located, so that people can really understand how their IT estate is operating from a kind of environmental, and climate sustainability perspective, and then make decisions. Do I want to consolidate a certain number of servers? to operate, this particular application more efficiently. Maybe I would decide I'm not going to run it at certain times of day because at night there's wind and it's less carbon intensive. So those are some of the things that we're trying to enable. And, one of the things that I'm very proud of about the Sustainability Insight Center is that we took an approach to say, this isn't just about us, and it's just not just about HPE providing you insight into what our gear does. We realize not every piece of equipment in the data center has an HPE green rectangle logo on it. And so if you really need to make informed decisions, you need to see everything. And so that's actually baked into the solution, is that we have the ability to look at all your devices, including, those that were, potentially generated or manufactured by our competitors, so that you can make, you get a full, unified, complete view of your IT estate and can make decisions on it. And, over time, I think this ties back to the AI story, and that sort of, I mentioned how power hungry or how compute hungry AI is. This starts to tie back to, particularly better understanding the environmental impacts of using AI. Because I think you're starting to see a lot more discussion around this. What is the environmental impact of, climate impact of ChatGPT, GPT-4, GPT-5, right? The different models that are coming out. And so the only way you can start to talk about that is if you have real visibility into, what it actually takes what is the resource usage that goes into doing the computations that are associated with these models, because they are so compute hungry. And that may inform how you design and architect systems in the future, or just applications in the future. Maybe you don't always use the largest model, you use a combination of smaller models and bigger models, so that you can kind of optimize also the sort of carbon cost associated with an AI application.
Awesome. No, awesome. Really great. You do so much. Yeah, you make so many things. Arti, one other thing I want to ask you about per HP and we'll move on to ESAL. You had, prior to these roles, you had this responsibility per Cray, supercomputing, and I also did not realize that Cray became part of Hewlett Packard. You worked in sort of the supercomputing space. You were involved in the exascale stuff with RPE. We've profiled some of the, I say it's not true quantum computing, but some of this quantum computing light stuff that some companies are involved in now. What gets you excited in terms of I don't know what you call it anymore, if it's exacomputing, supercomputing, if there's another term for it, but in terms of where we're going with these really powerful machines, is this something you focus on at all anymore, or just think about it?
Yeah. I mean, so having moved to the office of the CTO, my scope is broader across all types of sort of organizational and enterprise computing. That being said, I think that what's exciting to me from an advanced computing perspective, and that can be size and scale and capability, it can mean a lot of different things, is, really still just goes back to, maybe the sort of, I don't know, 10-year-old with a telescope, or something like that, which is our ability to leverage computers to help us make sense of all the information that all these other cool instruments and things that we can build, and increasingly just even the data that are that collect data, and then the data we as people, as human beings, generate, through our activities on the internet, by, the transactions we make through the bank, all kinds of, we generate data all kinds of ways, even just by talking. There's, you're recording me, there's all this acoustic information that's coming into the recording device that we're using right now. And, I mean, to the extent that as human beings what motivates all of us is kind of to make sense of the world. And, I'm excited that we're seeing such a transition to these more, I don't know, kind of converged systems, and converged has a meaning in computing, but I actually mean something a little bit different than that, which is that, I'm thinking more about, how am I going to incorporate real-time sensor data into an application that I'm writing so that I can, use it to make other types of decisions or augment my ability to make decisions. I mean, I think that's one of the really fascinating things about all this work in autonomous systems, is that, you've got LiDAR systems, you've got, other types of optical systems, you have all these different ways that you're gathering data. And then you have this computer that's trying to make sense of it all in real time and either, tell you, hey, you're drifting, in the lane, course correct, and or eventually maybe course correct on its own. And that's kind of really, it's, you forget sometimes, because most of us now have sort of like, lane guidance software in our cars. We've had it for a few years, but that's pretty sci-fi. Like that felt sci-fi, maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago. That felt like, wow, we're really going to be able to do that. And now you kind of take it for granted, that you can do certain things like that. So I think that's really what interests me the most, is the extent to which we're trying to take all these advances in all these different areas, whether that be networking, whether that be cellular, sort of technology, whether that be, kind of really high powered computing, and bring it all together so that you can do some, whatever's next.
Let's talk about ESAL now, because not that you don't have enough responsibilities, but so we have local government, community engagement, and all of these issues that make up our daily lives, that require science and technology. We have engineers and scientists that have a lot of great knowledge, but don't always know how to engage with these governmental systems. You founded the Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally organization to address the gap and bring everybody together. And we'll be putting the link to the ESAL site on in the bio of the show, but just looking at some of this stuff here, everything from programs on evidence-driven solutions to the opioid epidemic to regulations for salmon fishing. You got some interesting program on advancing science here in education in Pennsylvania. I'm hanging out in Pennsylvania. That's cool. What's ESAL all about? And tell us a little bit.
No, thank you for asking. So yeah, Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally, we turned 7 a couple months ago, which, it's easy for me to remember because I launched ESAL while I was on maternity leave with my son. And so, but really, we have kind of 2 core goals. One is to increase the number of people with backgrounds in STEM who are engaged with their local governments and local communities. As you've pointed out, we sort of define local broadly. It's kind of anything non-federal, and then to provide them with sort of the resources to do so effectively. And the origin story of ESAL is really, we talked about my time in Washington. I left Washington. I moved back to California, started working in tech, and found that I still had an interest in being engaged with sort of more policy and government decision making. And believe it or not, I drove past a billboard that was advertising applications being accepted for boards and commissions in the city of Hayward, which is where I live. And so I said, well, I'll apply. And, I got appointed to a task force that was dealing with kind of litter and urban blight, and started to realize that, hey, I worked on the Hill, and I went there through a program designed to put people with backgrounds in STEM in the federal government. And, no one's really paying attention to all these STEM related issues that affect local communities. Litter, for example, is a particular issue in the San Francisco Bay Area because we had mandates from the EPA to ensure zero waste to the Bay by now. And if you don't address litter adequately, it's difficult to meet that because it drains through the storm drains out to the bay. And so that's just one example of a STEM issue you might not think about. And when you're picking up trash on the weekends, which is one of the things that I did. And so, yeah, I actually started by asking alumni from the program that first took me to Washington how many others had started to work in local governments. And I got some responses from folks who had, but I got more from people who were interested but didn't know how to get started. And I thought, well, these have to be some of the most policy aware scientists and engineers in the country. And if they don't know how to get started, there's probably something we can do, to help. And so that's sort of the genesis of engineers and scientists acting locally. We focus a lot on sort of skill building and training to help people understand how local government works, how it's structured, like Civics 101, and then make them aware of kind of issues at the intersection of STEM and kind of local decision making, and then kind of tools and opportunities to help them find a way to get started working on issues that they're passionate about. I think also especially with certain issues like COVID-19 response, like climate change response, there was often a lot of focus at what's happening at the national level, but critical areas of decision making and response are local. And so for climate, for example, if local governments don't also have their own climate action plans and don't do certain things from a decision-making perspective, if public utility commissions don't make certain changes, then any kind of national climate policy will not eventually be implemented. Because you'll get stuck in vehicle electrification will get stuck in things like whether or not you can be approved to add a charger to your garage, from residential building codes will become the barrier to vehicle electrification, for example. And so that's really what we've been trying to do with engineers and scientists acting locally. It's been really interesting because, I've interacted with a lot of students and scientists and engineers across the country, and it's helped me also see the sort of all of the different reasons people go into STEM, and then sometimes we slot people into these careers that are very narrow compared to the passion that made them want to become a scientist in the first place. And so it's also just sort of opened my eyes to, in some ways, the ways we might even be failing our budding scientists and engineers, and we really need to give people inspiration to see how their work can, and it's not just their work, but how they, being who they are, can, do interesting things and impactful things in the communities around them.
And I noticed that you a couple of months ago you were in Denver at the AAS meeting, and the topic of your panel was become an advocate for science policy in your local community. So you're really spreading the word on that. That being said, what else is coming up for Arti Garg in 2024? Other public-facing stuff that we should know about, conferences, talks, meetings where we can run into you and listen to you. Anything else on the calendar that I missed that you want to talk about, please?
Yeah, well, the next sort of public-facing place that I will be that is actually in Las Vegas for HPE's annual Discover conference, which is really more of a conference for our partners and customers, but I think maybe you'll actually start to see some videos of me online soon talking about, we didn't really talk about it, but some of the work that we've been doing from the Office of the CTO to drive innovation across the different parts of HPE. And we've sort of I think, hit upon a somewhat, I don't know if it's totally unique, but at least a very effective way of accelerating innovative new technologies and ideas into products and solutions. And that kind of cuts beyond computing even, right?
Yeah.
It's really a process of how you sort of take how you work across boundaries in a very large organization.
Sure.
So I'll be there. Another thing that's on the horizon for me is I've been working with the OECD for several years now on a committee on AI, compute, and climate. And so trying to kind of build better ways for governments to understand how to position their investments in AI compute, but we're focusing more and more on the sort of environmental impacts of AI. And so it's not 100% for sure yet, but most likely the OECD will be kicking off an effort with the IEEE around building environmental standards, kind of setting environmental standards to measure the environmental impact of AI, I should say. And I think this is really important because I alluded to this being a concern, understanding the resource usage associated with training and running AI models. But the truth is, there's no sort of agreed upon way to do this. What counts, what doesn't count? Do you count the construction of the data center? What do you count? And so we just need to be counting the same things. There's an art to this though, because you want to count consistently, and that's really important, but consistency can't come at like the cost of leaving out really important things that you should be counting. So that's an area that I'll probably be ramping up my focus on in the next 6 months or so. And anytime you start talking about the environmental impacts of AI, you have to also talk about though the different ways that AI is also creating environmental benefits, whether, one of the important ones potentially being operating a grid that has a lot more intermittent renewables, particularly if they're also distributed across the electricity grid. How do you do that? AI is a critical piece of being able to operate, I think, the sort of future electricity grid effectively. It's also a critical part of being able to operate just sort of these flatter cellular networks, which, I mean, when you start to think about what cellular technology enables, it's hard to overstate the importance of it. And AI is critical to that, but that means we need to understand how to operate it in a way that is also sustainable from an environmental perspective.
No, it's what an amazing journey. I mean, I'm sitting here really enjoying everything you're teaching us, Arti, and thinking, we started off at the Cosmos and we went to Capitol Hill, and then you took us through science, technology, innovation at one of the world's largest tech companies, and you continue to innovate and come up with new plans and new strategies. And I'm excited for you. I so enjoyed the story, and again, listening to guests like you with such a multidimensional background, and really I'm going to look forward to continue to follow your journey offline, but hopefully we can do an update maybe down the line and see what you're up to in a couple of years. But really, really great stuff. I guess for everybody that is going to be listening to this particular episode of our show across the various podcast networks, or watching on our YouTube channel, you've been spending time with Dr. Arti Garg, Head of Technology Strategy and Evaluation, Office of the Chief Technology Officer, and Senior Distinguished Technologist, Hewlett Packard Enterprise. Arti, I really want to thank you for the time that you spent with us today, talking about all these topics, talking about your journey. Obviously, thank you for doing everything you do to advance STEM in all of our communities. And as we like to say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for everybody out there via the science and technology that you're involved in promoting and advancing it. Really a great story, and I wish you the best with all of it as you continue with this amazing career.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show. It's been really fun to kind of walk through this journey as well. So I really appreciate your having me on the show.
Great having you.